In the year 1162, somewhere on the windswept steppes of Mongolia, a child was born who would grow to become history's most feared conqueror. This infant, clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist according to legend, would one day command armies that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. His name was Temujin, but the world would come to know him by a title that still sends chills down spines 8 centuries later: Genghis Khan. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Behind the military genius and empire building lay a mind capable of devising punishments so horrific that entire cities would surrender at the mere mention of his approach. The methods I'm about to reveal aren't just stories of medieval brutality. They're calculated psychological warfare tactics designed to break the human spirit before breaking the human body. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about medieval warfare. These aren't random acts of violence committed in the heat of battle. These are systematic torture techniques refined over decades of conquest, engineered to send a message that would echo across continents. The Mongol Empire didn't just expand through superior military tactics. It grew through terror so absolute that resistance became unthinkable. Now, before we dive into the darkest chapters of human history, I need to tell you something that might surprise you. Much of what we think we know about Mongol torture methods comes from sources written by their enemies. Chroniclers who had every reason to exaggerate or fabricate stories of brutality. The surviving Mongol records themselves paint a different picture, often claiming they showed mercy to those who surrendered willingly. But the accounts from Persian historians, Chinese chroniclers, and European witnesses tell a story so consistent in its horror that we can't simply dismiss it as propaganda. The truth lies somewhere between legend and historical fact. But even accounting for exaggeration, what emerges is a portrait of systematic cruelty that defies comprehension. These methods weren't born from sadistic pleasure, though that certainly played a role. They were tools of empire, weapons as carefully crafted as any sword or bow. Each technique served a specific purpose in the Mongol strategy of conquest through psychological dominance. Let me start with one of the most documented cases of Mongol justice, a story that perfectly illustrates how Genghis Khan dealt with those who dared to cross him. In 1218, a caravan of merchants traveled along the Silk Road carrying goods worth the equivalent of millions in today's currency. These weren't just any merchants. They were official trade representatives sent by Genghis Khan himself to establish diplomatic and commercial relations with the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states of its time. The caravan arrived at the city of Otrar, where it encountered Inalchuk, the provincial governor who controlled this vital trading post. Instead of welcoming these diplomatic envoys, Inalchuk made a decision that would seal the fate of his entire empire. He accused the merchants of being Mongol spies, confiscated their goods, and ordered their execution. Every single member of the caravan was killed, their bodies left to rot outside the city walls. When news of this massacre reached Genghis Khan, his response was swift and terrifying. He didn't just declare war on the Khwarezmian Empire. He promised to erase it from existence. But first, he had a special punishment in mind for the man who had dared to murder his ambassadors. The siege of Otrar began in 1219, and when the city finally fell after 5 months of desperate resistance, Inalchuk was captured alive. What happened next has been recorded by multiple historical sources, though the exact details vary in their gruesome specifics. According to Persian chroniclers, Genghis Khan ordered that molten silver be poured into Inalchuk's ears and eyes. Other accounts describe liquid metal being forced down his throat. The symbolism was deliberate and chilling. Silver represented the wealth that Inalchuk had stolen from the merchant caravan. The method of execution turned the very thing he had coveted into the instrument of his destruction. But this was just the beginning. The destruction as a preview of what would happen to Otrar, serve any city that dared resist Mongol rule. The psychological impact rippled across Central Asia like a shockwave. Cities began surrendering without a fight, their inhabitants having heard whispered accounts of what the Mongols did to those who opposed them. The Mongol approach to torture wasn't random or chaotic. It was systematic, almost scientific in its application. Different methods were reserved for different types of enemies, each designed to send a specific message. Nobles and rulers faced one category of punishment, while common soldiers encountered another entirely. Civilians who resisted faced yet another set of horrors, carefully calibrated to their perceived level of defiance. One of the most psychologically devastating techniques involved what modern historians call bloodless execution methods. The Mongols held religious beliefs that made them reluctant to spill noble blood directly onto the earth. This spiritual constraint didn't make them more merciful. Instead, it forced them to become more creative in their cruelty. During the conquest of Kiev in 1240, Mongol forces captured several Russian princes who had led the resistance against their advance. Rather than simply executing these nobles with swords or arrows, the Mongols developed a method that would become one of their most infamous practices. The captured princes were bound and placed beneath wooden platforms. Then, as the Mongol commanders and their retinues celebrated their victory above, the weight of dozens of dancing, feasting warriors slowly crushed the life out of the men below. The accounts describe how the celebration continued for hours, while the screams of the dying nobles provided a horrific soundtrack to the festivities. This wasn't just execution. It was performance art designed to demonstrate absolute dominance over the defeated enemy. The message was clear. Resistance to Mongol rule would result in not just death, but death transformed into entertainment for the conquerors. Another bloodless method involved the use of carpets and horses. When Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, captured Baghdad in 1258, he reserved a special fate for the last Abbasid caliph. Al-Mustasim was wrapped in carpets and then trampled to death by horses. The religious significance was deliberate. Islamic law prohibited the spilling of royal blood, so the Mongols found a way to kill the caliph while technically respecting this prohibition. The irony was as cruel as it was calculated. These bloodless executions served multiple purposes beyond simple killing. They demonstrated the Mongols' knowledge of their enemies' cultural and religious beliefs, showing that they could corrupt and pervert even the most sacred traditions. They also created spectacles of humiliation that would be remembered and recounted across the Islamic world, serving as warnings to other rulers who might consider resistance. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Mongol torture methods was their unpredictability. Surrender didn't guarantee mercy, and resistance didn't always result in death. The Mongols understood that uncertainty bred fear more effectively than consistent brutality. Sometimes entire cities that surrendered immediately were spared completely. Other times, cities that offered no resistance were destroyed anyway, their populations massacred to send a message to distant enemies who might never have heard of the original settlement. This calculated unpredictability created a climate of terror that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Rulers hundreds of miles away from any Mongol army would receive detailed reports of the latest atrocities, never knowing whether submission or resistance offered the better chance of survival. The psychological warfare was as effective as any siege engine or cavalry charge. The scale of these operations was unprecedented in medieval warfare. When the Mongols decided to make an example of a city, they didn't just kill the defenders. They systematically eliminated entire populations, often organizing the slaughter with the same efficiency they applied to military logistics. Teams of executioners would work in shifts, processing thousands of victims per day while keeping careful records of the body count. The methodical nature of these mass executions reveals something even more disturbing than random violence. The Mongols turned death into an industrial process, complete with quality control measures and efficiency metrics. At the siege of Merv in 1221, contemporary accounts describe how Genghis Khan positioned himself on a golden throne to personally oversee the systematic execution of the city's inhabitants. This wasn't the heat of battle or the chaos of a sacking. This was organized, deliberate, and thoroughly planned entertainment. Each citizen of Merv was dragged before the Khan individually, creating a procession of death that lasted for days. The wealthy inhabitants faced special treatment designed to extract maximum value before their execution. They were tortured until they revealed the locations of hidden treasures, their screams echoing across the city as a reminder to others of what awaited those who tried to conceal their wealth. The psychological pressure was immense. Watching neighbors and family members tortured for information created a climate where people would betray their own relatives to avoid similar fates. The numbers from Merv alone stagger the imagination. Persian historians recorded that over during the siege and 1,300,000 people were killed its aftermath. Even accounting for the tendency of medieval chroniclers to exaggerate, we're talking about the complete erasure of one of Central Asia's most important cities. But the Mongols weren't content with simple mass murder. They wanted to ensure that their message would be remembered for generations. This brings us to one of their most psychologically devastating practices: the construction of human monuments from the bodies of their victims. After the massacre at Merv, Mongol forces spent days arranging corpses into massive pyramids that could be seen from miles away. These weren't random piles of bodies. They were carefully engineered structures designed for maximum visual impact and long-term preservation. The pyramids served as billboards advertising Mongol power to anyone who might pass through the region in the coming months or years. The technique reached its most horrific expression during the siege of Nishapur in 1221. This attack was personal for the Mongols. The city had killed Tokuchar, who was married to one of Genghis Khan's daughters. The Khan's daughter herself reportedly requested that every living thing in the city be destroyed as revenge for her husband's death. What followed was perhaps the most systematic act of genocide in medieval history. When Nishapur fell, the Mongols didn't just kill the inhabitants. They organized the slaughter with bureaucratic precision. 3 separate pyramids were constructed from the severed heads of the victims. One pyramid for men, one for women, and one for children. The symbolism was deliberate and chilling. Even in death, the social order that had defined the city was preserved, but transformed into a monument to Mongol dominance. The accounts describe how Mongol soldiers spent weeks hunting down every survivor who had hidden in cellars, sewers, or ruins. Dogs, cats, and even rats were killed to ensure that nothing living remained in the city. Only 400 skilled craftsmen were spared, selected for their useful trades and transported back to Mongolia as slaves. The rest of Nishapur's population, estimated at over 170,000 people, became raw materials for the skull pyramids that dominated the landscape. But the Mongols had an even more terrifying method reserved for captured enemy soldiers. The mass-burning pits represented a fusion of practical necessity and psychological warfare that demonstrates the calculated nature of Mongol cruelty. After major battles, thousands of wounded or captured soldiers would present a logistical problem. Feeding and guarding so many prisoners required resources that mobile armies couldn't spare. The Mongol solution was as efficient as it was horrifying. Large pits would be excavated near the battlefield, sometimes by the prisoners themselves as their final act of forced labor. The captives would then be herded into these earthen chambers packed so tightly that movement became impossible. Fire would be set at the bottom of the pit, creating a furnace effect that slowly roasted the trapped soldiers alive. The screams could be heard for miles, serving as a warning to any enemy forces in the area about the fate that awaited them if they continued to resist. One particularly well-documented incident involved over 500 Russian soldiers captured during the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe. Contemporary chroniclers describe how the Mongols celebrated their victory, while the burning pit consumed their enemies just yards away. The contrast was deliberate. Mongol warriors feasted and sang songs of triumph while their former opponents died in agony within sight and hearing of the festivities. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Survivors who escaped these mass executions would carry tales of Mongol brutality across Europe and Asia, spreading terror more effectively than any army could march. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legends that parents would use to frighten children and that rulers would invoke when deciding whether to surrender or fight against approaching Mongol forces. Even more disturbing was the Mongol practice of battlefield accounting through mutilation. After major victories, Mongol commanders needed accurate casualty counts to report back to their superiors. Rather than simply estimating enemy dead, they developed a system that served both administrative and psychological purposes. The right ear would be cut from every enemy corpse, creating a precise tally of enemy casualties while simultaneously creating a gruesome spectacle. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, Mongol forces reportedly filled 9 large sacks with the severed ears of European knights and soldiers. These macabre trophies weren't just kept for record-keeping purposes, they were displayed prominently during victory celebrations and sometimes sent as gifts to Mongol commanders in distant theaters of war. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who stand against us. The ear collection practice spread terror throughout medieval Europe in ways that conventional warfare never could. Survivors would describe seeing fields carpeted with mutilated corpses, their missing ears creating a distinctive pattern of disfigurement that marked them as victims of Mongol justice. The site became so associated with Mongol victories that the mere rumor of approaching armies with this reputation would cause entire regions to evacuate. But the Mongols had developed techniques that went far beyond simple battlefield mutilation. They understood that the human mind could be broken just as thoroughly as the human body, and they crafted methods of psychological torture that would haunt their victims long after any physical wounds had healed. One of their most insidious practices involved the systematic corruption of family bonds and social structures within captured populations. When Mongol forces occupied a city after a siege, they would often spare the lives of the inhabitants only to subject them to a form of living nightmare that many survivors described as worse than death. Families would be deliberately separated, with parents forced to watch as their children were selected for different fates. Some would be marked for slavery, others for execution, and still others for incorporation into Mongol auxiliary forces. The selection process was designed to appear random, creating an atmosphere of desperate hope mixed with inevitable despair. The cruelest aspect of this practice was that parents were often given the illusion of choice. A Mongol commander might announce that a family could save one child by sacrificing another, or that a mother could preserve her daughter's life by personally executing her son. These impossible decisions weren't just torture for the individuals involved, they were calculated to destroy the social fabric that held communities together. When neighbors were forced to betray neighbors and parents to choose between children, the bonds of trust that made organized resistance possible simply disintegrated. Contemporary accounts describe how entire populations would be paralyzed by these psychological games. People who might have fought desperately to defend their city walls would become docile and compliant once the Mongols began their systematic dismantling of human relationships. The technique was so effective that many cities began surrendering immediately upon news of an approaching Mongol army, their inhabitants having heard detailed accounts of what awaited them if they resisted. The Mongols also perfected a method of execution that combined physical agony with spiritual torment in ways that seemed designed by someone who understood the deepest fears of the human psyche. The technique, which became known among their enemies as the Dance of Death, involved suspending victims just above ground level using ropes or chains attached to their wrists. The positioning was calculated with precision. The victims' feet would barely touch the earth, forcing them to support their entire body weight on their shoulders and arms. As hours passed, the victims' muscles would begin to fail, causing them to sink lower until their feet could provide some relief. But this respite was temporary and came at a terrible cost. The ropes would cut deeper into their wrists as their full weight settled onto the bonds. Eventually, circulation would be cut off entirely, leading to a slow death from blood loss and organ failure that could take days to complete. The psychological component of this torture was equally devastating. Victims could see other prisoners suffering the same fate just yards away, creating a gallery of dying humans that served as both warning and entertainment for Mongol forces. The sight of dozens of people slowly dying in synchronized agony created an atmosphere of hopelessness that broke the will of even the strongest resistance fighters. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated of all Mongol torture methods was what historians now call the theater of false mercy. This technique exploited the human capacity for hope in ways that seem almost scientifically designed to maximize psychological damage. Prisoners would be brought before Mongol commanders and offered apparently genuine opportunities for clemency or reduced sentences in exchange for information or cooperation. The offers were often quite specific and believable. A captured soldier might be promised that his family would be spared if he revealed the locations of hidden weapons caches. A city official might be told that the civilian population would receive food and medical care if he provided detailed maps of defensive fortifications. These weren't empty promises made in the heat of interrogation. They were carefully crafted negotiations that could extend over days or weeks. The cruel genius of this method lay in its unpredictability. Sometimes the Mongols would actually honor these agreements, sparing promised individuals or providing the negotiated benefits. This created a reputation for keeping their word that made future victims more likely to cooperate. But more often, the promises would be broken in the most devastating way possible. A prisoner who had betrayed military secrets to save his family might be forced to watch as his loved ones were executed anyway, their deaths made more brutal because of his cooperation. The psychological impact of these broken promises was far more damaging than simple torture would have been. Victims didn't just suffer physical pain or fear of death, they experienced the complete destruction of their moral framework. People who had maintained their integrity through months of warfare and siege would find themselves transformed into collaborators and traitors, only to discover that their betrayals had accomplished nothing except the corruption of their own souls. This technique proved particularly effective against religious leaders and community elders whose moral authority was essential for maintaining organized resistance. A respected imam or Christian priest who publicly cooperated with Mongol demands in exchange for promises of mercy for their congregation would find their spiritual authority permanently destroyed, regardless of whether the Mongols ultimately kept their word. The community's faith in both their religious leaders and their own moral systems would be shattered, making future resistance nearly impossible to organize. The Mongols understood that destroying a society's leadership structure was more effective than simply killing large numbers of people. Dead martyrs could inspire future resistance, but corrupted leaders who had been seen to betray their own principles became living symbols of defeat that poisoned the morale of entire populations for generations. Even more sophisticated was their use of what modern psychologists might recognize as learned helplessness on a massive scale. Mongol forces would sometimes spare cities that surrendered immediately, treating their inhabitants with relative kindness and even providing aid during reconstruction efforts. These examples of mercy weren't random acts of compassion. They were carefully calculated to create a psychological framework where submission was associated with survival and resistance was linked to inevitable destruction. The technique worked because it gave populations facing Mongol invasion a rational basis for choosing surrender over resistance. Stories would spread of cities that had submitted early and been treated well, contrasted with detailed accounts of the horrific fates that befell those who had chosen to fight. This created a psychological trap where resistance began to seem not just futile, but actually immoral. Leaders who advocated fighting against the Mongols could be portrayed as condemning their own people to unnecessary suffering when a peaceful alternative was available. The sophistication of this psychological manipulation becomes clear when we consider how it interacted with Mongol military tactics. Their armies were highly mobile and could appear suddenly at cities hundreds of miles apart within the span of a few weeks. This meant that communities had very little time to verify the stories they heard about Mongol treatment of other populations. Rumors and legends would arrive ahead of the armies themselves, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. In this psychological landscape, the actual torture methods employed by the Mongols became secondary to their reputation for employing such techniques. The threat of the dance of death or the burning pits was often more effective than their actual implementation. Cities would surrender and populations would comply based on stories they had heard rather than atrocities they had personally witnessed. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire Mongol approach to conquest and control. They had essentially weaponized human imagination, turning people's capacity to envision suffering into a tool of psychological warfare more powerful than any siege engine or cavalry charge. The human mind's ability to anticipate and fear future pain became the Mongols' greatest ally in their campaigns of expansion. The effectiveness of this psychological warfare extended far beyond the immediate conquest period. Generations after Mongol armies had passed through a region, local populations would still carry cultural memories of their ancestors' submission and the terrible prices paid by those who had chosen to resist. These collective memories became part of regional folklore, ensuring that the psychological impact of Mongol methods would continue to influence political and social behavior long after the empire itself had fragmented and declined. Modern historians studying the long-term effects of Mongol conquest have identified patterns of political passivity and social fragmentation in regions that experienced intensive Mongol psychological warfare that persisted for centuries after the original invasions. The techniques developed by Genghis Khan and his successors didn't just conquer territories. They fundamentally altered the psychological and cultural DNA of entire civilizations, creating changes that would echo through history in ways that the Mongols themselves probably never anticipated or intended. The legacy of these psychological campaigns reveals something even more disturbing about the Mongol approach to empire building. They understood that true conquest required more than territorial control. It demanded the systematic restructuring of human consciousness on a continental scale. The torture methods we've examined weren't just tools of war. They were instruments of social engineering designed to create populations that would police themselves long after Mongol armies had moved on to new conquests. Consider the broader implications of entire civilizations learn to associate what we've uncovered. When resistance with unspeakable suffering, they began to develop cultural mechanisms that actively discouraged defiance of authority. Parents would teach their children that submission was wisdom, not cowardice. Religious leaders would preach that acceptance of conquest was divinely ordained rather than politically imposed. These weren't just temporary adaptations to military occupation. They became permanent features of social organization that would persist for generations. The Mongols had essentially created a form of cultural programming that made their empire self-sustaining through psychological rather than military means. Once a population had been properly conditioned through exposure to their methods, the actual presence of Mongol forces became unnecessary. The threat of their return was sufficient to maintain order and extract tribute from regions thousands of miles from the nearest Mongol garrison. The methods we've explored today reveal something far more disturbing than simple medieval brutality. Genghis Khan and his successors didn't just conquer lands, they conquered minds. These torture techniques weren't born from sadistic impulse alone. They were precision instruments of psychological warfare that transformed human terror into a weapon more devastating than any cavalry charge. 8 centuries later, we still struggle to comprehend how systematically they weaponized fear itself. The true horror lies not just in what they did, but in how effectively they proved that the human capacity for hope and imagination could be turned against itself to create empires that would endure long after the last Mongol warrior had fallen.